Man, recording a video is very difficult. Hi, my name is Vali, but you can call me Luca. As you may or may not know, I'm a psychology graduate and I'm also a trainee in emotion-focused therapy. One of the main things I've learned about emotions is that they're effectively our internal GPS. We just live life through emotions, not through our rationality, not through our beliefs or anything like that. In this video, I will be breaking down everything you need to know about what emotions are, what emotions aren't, and how you can use emotions to better understand yourself. What this video isn't about is the neurochemistry of emotions. I just don't think it's particularly important to us at this moment. If it would have been important, we probably would have all chugged down feel-good medicine every day and be living very different lives by now. So, every emotion has 4 components to it. Context, what triggered the emotion, personal meaning, what it means to us personally, bodily felt sensations, or how this emotion feels in our body, and also action tendency, or what the emotion needs, what need it signals. During emotion processing, at least in emotion-focused therapy, this is very important because we cannot further process an emotion that we cannot outline or identify. But to actually do that, to further process this emotion that we've identified, whatever the emotion is, there are a few somewhat clear stages, starting with the stage of awareness, which includes identification through the components that we've talked about before, but also tolerance and acceptance of the emotion. Not being able to tolerate the emotion means that it just never kind of shows up on the radar because it is too much, it is too heavy, it is too painful, and for each their own reason and personal history. Not being able to accept the emotion means that it does bubble up, but for whatever reason, probably because it's socially unacceptable, we push it back down. If you want to think about it this way, emotion intolerance is akin to emotional repression, whereas not being able to accept the emotion is akin to emotional suppression. But after that comes the step of symbolization, which effectively means that you're trying to find the right words to describe the emotional experience. You know, such as, oh man, I want to be free, I don't want to be sad, and oh man, I feel like I'm buried underneath the ground where I don't have to deal with criticism and shame, and I felt like this for so long, and I just need to be free from unjust. Around this time also comes the stage of regulation, because emotions come with a certain intensity and we don't want it to be too much or under-regulated, in which case we can tone it down using various relaxation or grounding techniques or anything along those lines. But we also don't want it to be too cold or too distant. And we will try to get closer to that emotion, partly through those initial components, emotional components that we've introduced before. And we need to work on regulating the emotion if it's underregulated or overregulated, because it effectively acts as a barrier in emotion processing this way. Now, technically, the last 3 steps include expression of the emotion with, all the personal meaning and the intensity, the pain, everything that has to do with this emotion, it needs to be expressed. Then, in light of everything that's happened with this emotion, including what happened when we expressed it, comes the stage of reflection. And finally, after that, we effectively let ourselves make room for this emotion to essentially go away and for another one to come in and replace it, which is also called the stage of transformation. Alright, moving on to types of emotion, and we'll start off with primary emotions, which are the ones that appear first in any given situation, and which are, at least initially, adaptive, because they point us towards getting what we need. Of course, when we are young, we are actually very much dependent, including emotionally, on our parents. And what does happen frequently as kids is that at some point our parents might not be able or willing to help us process some emotion. And the problem with that is that emotion doesn't really go away in all of its complexity and intensity, and now also frustration. And so growing up into our 20s and 30s and so on, in similar situations we will feel similarly as to how we did as kids. But what would have been adaptive as kids, being sad, for example, which is essentially asking for help, protection, support, and so on, might later on in life turn out to be maladaptive, because in similar situations now, people won't give that support to you, right? So you need to instead feel differently and in a more adaptive way. These primary emotions that were not processed properly at the time and which still haunt us to this day are usually called maladaptive primary emotions. We can also talk about shame or guilt as primary emotions, and they do have an adaptive function, meaning that they do help us maintain our social relationships, but most of the time they're actually secondary emotions. Now, these secondary emotions, as you might guess, are cover-up emotions. They cover up those primary emotions that we can't really show or process properly, especially in cases where the primary emotions are not really socially acceptable. Think of, and this is at least partly a cultural stereotype, men who get destructively angry when they would otherwise be on the brink of crying, or women who cry where in fact they would likely Secondary emotions are by default maladaptive because they don't allow essentially the primary emotions from underneath to do their job and point us in the right direction with what we actually need. Now, the third and last general type of emotion, though in some sense more rare, is instrumental emotion. It's something additional to the rest of our emotional framework and is used primarily because it elicits an advantageous response from others. Think of crocodile tears, for example. In therapy, when they arise, instrumental emotions are explored in terms of course, genuineness, motivation, or desired outcome, because they're not necessarily a problem, though there might be a better way to navigate a specific situation. Now, as I said before, emotions are people's internal GPS because they point us toward what we need. So now we'll go over what every emotion needs. And by the way, this is no be-all and end-all. I mean, it could deviate from one person to another. And we'll start off with anger. Anger enforces boundaries. It tells us when something or someone has crossed a line, violated our values, or threatened our well-being. The need here is for respect, to feel that our boundaries are acknowledged or valued, or for change/justice, to address what's wrong, correct a situation, or defend ourselves. So if someone interrupts you repeatedly during a meeting, your anger signals that you need to assert yourself and make yourself be heard. Moving on to sadness. Sadness helps us process loss. It allows us to grieve and let go of things or people that were important to us, and the need would be either for comfort and support, which is to feel cared for and understood in difficult times, or for rest and reflection, which is to slow down and process what the loss means for us. Next up we have fear, which is pretty straightforward. It protects us by alerting us to danger or risk. It primes us to act quickly and get to safety. Here the needs are usually for safety or for reassurance. joy. And this is something that I was particularly surprised by when I realized it myself. When you achieve a goal or when good things happen, there is a need attached to that happiness. By allowing yourself to feel your joy, it motivates you to keep pursuing and keep engaged to exactly that which makes you happy and fulfilled. Joy signals wanting to share our happiness with others and stay present and appreciate the moment. Next, disgust. So disgust protects us from harm by pushing us away from things that could be toxic, whether it's spoiled food, harmful environments, or even people with actions that violate our moral standards. Here, similarly to fear, there is a need of protection, but there is also a need for integrity of personal values. Next, and finally, we have guilt and shame. Here I'm gonna talk about them together because guilt essentially refers to something more specific, like an action, whereas shame refers to, well, sort of an overall judgment of the person who did something wrong. If you feel guilty, you're referring to a specific wrongdoing, whereas if you feel shame, you're more so talking about yourself as a whole person and not just a particular action. In both cases where shame or guilt are adaptive, one possible need is to feel like you've made things right. If not realistic, in the case of guilt, the need is for being forgiven, or in the case of shame, it's to feel seen and valued even after what has happened. Lastly, surprise is also considered an emotion. It essentially pushes you to reorient yourself and make sense of what just happened. Alright, now what isn't an emotion? Or at least not a primary emotion? In the otherwise pretty flawed psychiatric handbook, the DSM, anything that a client might come in with, say along the lines of an affective disorder, anxiety, depression, or anything like that, we can consider it not to be an emotion, at least not a primary emotion. The reason we have secondary emotions is so that, again, we get to, in a way, live to fight another day. Because right now, we don't really have the resources to deal with that intense primary emotion, so we might as well cover it up with something that can hold temporarily. The problem is, sometimes we don't get to make use of any kind of support that can help us process that emotion. And so this internal issue doesn't go away.
It just keeps getting worse and worse and worse.
And here I'll start off with depression. You may hear people say that they feel depressed, and I don't really have anything against that. I myself say that from time to time, that I feel depressed. But depression is not an emotion. On quite the contrary, depression is the chronic divorce from very painful emotions that have been left unprocessed over the years. Oh, and by the way, I have a short video about that right on this channel if you're interested. Now, what else isn't an emotion? Well, and I know this is gonna be somewhat controversial, but anxiety and worry are not exactly emotions either. They can be seen as a form of primary adaptive fear, because feeling anxious about an unsafe situation can prompt you to take precautions. However, most of the time, anxiety is effectively a secondary response to a stressful situation and a consequence of unfinished or interrupted emotional processing. Yes, you can definitely feel anxious about an exam, but would you still have felt anxious if you didn't go through something similar before, where you seemingly underperformed and were in turn severely criticized and left with no support, to say the least? In this sense, anxiety and worry are trying to help you avoid not painful situations, but painful emotions. And in the previous case, it was, of course, about shame. So anxiety is essentially this internal dialogue that you have with a part of yourself that doesn't want you to go through that same painful emotion you've had before. And in turn, it's giving you these mental hoops to jump through in order to make sure that it's not gonna happen again. But rarely, if ever, that actually happens. Usually, no answer is good enough for your anxiety to go away. It kind of just tires down by itself, unless it doesn't. And we have all kinds of internal splits like that, and I have another video exactly on that topic if you're interested. Lastly, I want to go over overwhelm, which it's not an emotion either. It's a state of dysregulation. Remember how I talked before about how we don't want our emotions to be underregulated? Well, overwhelm is a consequence of underregulation. For overregulation, we have states of dissociation, or as they're also called, self-interruptions. It's effectively when you put a thick wall or a large distance, too large a distance between you and the emotion. See you right there. I'm gonna do this as a test, because I'm not exactly sure if everything is set up properly.
Every day I have some food and everything seems like it's going to be fine. Then all of a sudden shit